right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So our first speaker, the invited speaker today is Carina Curto, from Penn State.
Right. Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? So first I'd like to thank the organizers, Linda and Brent especially, for inviting me. I've been coming to Cosyne for more than 10 years, I think, since I was a postdoc at Rutgers in Ken Harris's lab. And it's quite an honor to be able to give a talk today. So this is actually going to be a straight theory talk. So I'm in a math department, so I'm going to be unapologetic about it, I guess. So first I want to just review some, very sort of general ideas about dynamic attractors in the brain. And Mate Liangel did a nice job of talking about attractors and dynamic attractors. And so this is really old stuff. You guys have seen, most of you, the Hopfield model. And the idea of fixed point attractors as a model for memory patterns, static memory patterns. And then the famous result, where if you have a symmetric connectivity matrix, you're guaranteed convergence to one of these patterns. So more modern, there's the idea of bump attractors, which is very similar, except you have a continuum now, but they're still fixed points, right? So you still think of having a fixed point attractor, but maybe you have a parametric family of them. And this has been used to model position coding in hippocampus, and the ring model is an example of this, and so on. And many of you know this stuff way better than I do, so I'm just jogging your memory here. And one of the things that I thought about a little bit over the years was actually this model. So I've worked with bump attractors too. I have some papers in this, and I like it. But if you zoom in, for instance, on the typical setup, this is actually a cartoon from a Bujaki Lab review paper. But if you look at the typical setup of a rat running along a linear track, and you're recording from hippocampal place cells, and these are the place fields, and you zoom in, so down here this is the theta oscillation, the ongoing theta oscillation, and with the bump attractor models, you might expect at any location there's some kind of bump of activity, a fixed point that is encoding the animal's position in space. That's how the network is keeping track of the position. But when you look closely, you see this phenomenon of sequences, right? So you actually don't see a fixed point. You see the neurons fire in a sequence, and this is very well known and very well studied, the phenomenon of phase precession. But I just want you to pay attention to this because it looks like an attractor, but it's not necessarily a fixed point, right? It looks something like maybe a limit cycle or some kind of sequential dynamic attractor. So that's an idea I kind of want to put in your head. More generally, when I was a child, I had to memorize phone numbers, as many of you probably did too. And so the way I did it was I would just repeat the number in a loop over and over again in my head until I had to dial it or whatever. And this guy made a song to remember the phone number. If you guys know this song, this usually divides the audience in half by age, and I'm in the wrong half now. So it's another limit cycles, right, or periodic attractors is kind of a useful idea also for things like modeling central pattern generators, and so on. So it's an old idea, but I just kind of want to jog your memory on it. And then I have sort of a newer, this is slightly risky, but I'm going to do it. So some of you may remember, this isn't as funny anymore but some of you may remember the New Hampshire primary 2 years ago now, the Republican primary. Marco Rubio had a very interesting showing. I'm just going to show like 22 seconds of this clip. And I want you to pay attention to the time up here. Oh, the sound.
Obama doesn't know what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing.
So that's 8:30.
What's the spell of this fiction that Barack Obama doesn't know what he's doing? He knows exactly what he's doing.
And then again.
This notion that Barack Obama doesn't know what he's doing is just not true. He knows exactly what he's doing.
I love that. So, of course, he was criticized for being a robot and not a real human, but I thought, that's an attractor in his brain, right? And the basin of attraction is too large. That was the real problem. So that's don't overtrain your basin. Okay, so moving on. So the question I want to talk about today is what features of a network shape those emergent dynamics, and what I mean specifically is things like dynamic attractors. So of course this is Cosyne, and you guys know about all these. There's lots of complexity, right? Lots of aspects of a network that I am going to completely ignore for purposes of this talk. But emergent dynamics are a function of everything, right? But one of the things that people do pay attention to is statistics of connectivity, of course. And what I want to focus on actually is the precise pattern of connectivity. So I think oftentimes when we have network models, we go two extremes. Either the connectivity is random, or it follows some local statistics. Maybe you have two populations of neurons, and they have different in-degree, out-degree in their connectivity patterns, or it's highly structured, like in a ring model or a bump attractor network, where somehow the connectivity drops off regularly with distance, right? It's a kind of geometric pattern. And I actually would like to understand something in between, right? What if you really have complicated connectivity that is neither extreme? It's neither highly structured nor random. What can we say in those cases, and how is it going to be shaping the emergent dynamics? So that's the goal, to understand how precise connectivity shapes emergent dynamics. And one of the reasons I think this is timely is because we are collecting a lot of data as a community, and not me personally, but the connectomics has really taken off, and we are trying to understand precise connectivity, right? So neurons are special, right? They're cells that communicate in highly non-trivial and non-geometric ways, and non-random as well, I think. So this is one of the goals, is to try to understand this. But it's challenging, and it's challenging not just because we don't know enough about neural networks in the brain. It's challenging because mathematically it's hard. So if you want to look at how network structure affects dynamics in a situation that is not sort of the extreme of statistical random properties or very regular geometric structure of the network, there aren't that many results, right? So even the math is hard. Even if you have perfect knowledge of your network, even if you understand everything that you're doing, it's still pretty tricky. So our approach is going to be to develop some mathematical theory in the context of a simple model that really isolates the role of connectivity. And I'm going to tell you what we mean by success. So success for us is going to be having a kind of graphical calculus. So there's going to be an underlying directed graph, which is giving the architecture of the network. And we're going to be happy if we can somehow analyze the graph and make predictions about the dynamics, about the emergent dynamics, the attractors, and so on. And not just statistical predictions. Like, we want to say that set of neurons is going to support an attractor, if that makes sense. So you'll see in more detail. OK, so here's my lab. For those of you, again, who are younger, that's a chalkboard. They still exist in math departments across the country. And so I want to, and most of us are mathematicians, actually, so a few experimentalists. But so I want to, before I forget, just thank the main contributors to this work, mainly Katie Morrison, who is here, who was a postdoc with me shortly, but is really an equal collaborator in this at University of Northern Colorado, and then a couple of postdocs, Jesse Genison and Chris Langdon, who have worked hard on this for about a year now. And my former graduate student, Caitlin Parmalee, when you see the sequence prediction stuff at the end, that is coming out mostly from her thesis. And then some other collaborators who have worked with us and had interesting input over the years. So anyway, before I forget. OK, so what is the simple model I'm going to deal with? It's going to be a special case of threshold linear networks. So these equations are, I assume, familiar, right, to most of you. This is just a very simple rate model. And I've just made a choice on the nonlinearity. I want to use the threshold linear one, right? And the reason I make this choice and not other choices is because I can do more math with this choice, my style of math in here. So these networks, if you're familiar with them, they exhibit all kinds of nonlinear behavior. It's actually quite remarkable. When I show this, even to my colleagues in the math department, they're like, it's basically linear. Right? So you shouldn't have interesting nonlinear dynamics, because other than this threshold, locally, right, the behavior is linear. If you look at any point in the state space, unless you're actually on one of these boundaries, you have a linear system of ODEs, and linear systems of ODEs are boring. They have one fixed point, right? And unless it's degenerate, right? Non-degenerate ones have one fixed point, and it's either stable or it's unstable. And that's the end of the story. But somehow, when you put these brackets in, right, what happens is your state space all of a sudden gets chopped up. So these equations define hyperplanes, right? And you're chopping up your state space into this patchwork of linear systems. So locally, it's true everything is linear. But then you go through these walls, and a different linear system takes over. It's almost like billiard balls, right? You have this very regular dynamics locally, but then you transition through these different regions. And in those transitions, the nonlinear dynamics emerges. And you really get everything. Multi-stability, limit cycles, chaos, even quasi-periodic attractors. I'll show you that for those of you who know what that is. And the basic question here, if you were very ambitious, is given that matrix W, and given sort of more, so I'm using a uniform theta here, but give more generally a vector B of the bias here, or the external input, what can we say about the dynamics? What are the attractors? That would be kind of a very ambitious question. So there are some things, of course, that are known about these networks, even in a non, of course, in a case where you have a geometric Mexican hat-like connectivity and so on, there's a lot more known, right? But even in the general case, right, general W, if you constrain to symmetric, there are many things known. So in particular, actually, this is not just true for symmetric, this is true in general. For every support, there's at most one fixed point. And that is because your system really is this patchwork of linear systems. So every linear system has a fixed point, and that fixed point, however, may or may not lie in the correct chamber where the linear system applies. Does that make sense? So I have a linear system in some region, but maybe the fixed point for that linear system is lying way over here, and so that's not actually a fixed point of my network. But if it does lie in the right chamber, then I do have a fixed point of my network. And so basically, you can label the fixed points by the subsets of neurons that are coactive at the fixed point. And stability is easy to work out, and we also have a result kind of like the Hopfield model result, where you're guaranteed to converge to one of these stable fixed points in the symmetric case. And this follows really nice work that's actually now 15 years old or so by Hollister, Sung, and others. They developed this theory of permitted and forbidden sets for the symmetric case, had some very nice papers, including a Nature paper earlier than this, again, a long time ago. And several years ago, some collaborators and I picked up on this and continued working in the symmetric case, and we were able to develop some more of that theory. But then we got bored with it. Because stable fixed points, I started the talk by talking about dynamic attractors. I really want to investigate dynamic attractors, and I feel like we're only looking at the symmetric case because that's where the light shines, because linear algebra is better understood there, basically. So we want to go the other extreme. The idea is, let's look for networks that have no stable fixed points, and so we're guaranteed to get interesting dynamics. And in order to do this, we introduce a family. So these are all going to be threshold linear networks. They follow the same dynamics I've just shown you. They're just a special case, but it's a family that's labeled by the directed graph. So let me just show you the idea here. So you have a directed graph, and we think of this conceptually, right? And I don't want to argue about this because I know people will disagree. But we think of this as somehow we have a network of excitatory neurons and a sea of inhibition such that they're all fundamentally competing with each other. So this is an effectively inhibitory network, but some of them compete less harshly than others, right? And so the idea is if I have an edge, say, from this neuron to this neuron, then the effective competition from red to yellow is going to be lessened. And so I'm going to, in that case, when I have the edge, j goes to I, I'm going to make the weight a little higher. It's still inhibitory, because effectively I'm thinking we have all these interneurons in between, but I'm going to make it -1 plus epsilon. The -1, by the way, is just the normalized constant for the leak term here. So if I have an edge, I think that I'm inhibiting you less than I naturally inhibit myself due to my own leak term. And if I don't have an edge, right, if j does not have an edge to I, that means I'm inhibiting you more strongly than I inhibit myself. Okay, so that's the way it works. And so epsilon and delta need to be positive. They don't need to be small. They just need to be positive. this drive, if you notice, this matrix is all negative, right, with these constraints, because epsilon has to be less than 1, so there's no chance of going positive. So this theta better be positive, or you're just going to have the activity die. So you think of an external drive to the network. The recurrent network is effectively inhibitory, but there are two strengths of inhibition, weak inhibition and strong inhibition. And the interesting thing is that you can, in a network like this, you can actually rule out stable fixed points completely, just based on a property of the graph, but still maintain bounded activity, which is not surprising because the weights are all negative. So in particular, if G is an oriented graph with no sinks, that means there are no bidirectional edges and no sinks in the graph theory sense, then the network has no stable fixed points but bounded activity. And so this is the smallest example of such a graph, just a simple 3-cycle. And you can see here what happens. So here I make my matrix. I've chosen an epsilon and a delta within my parameter regime, within my legal range. It doesn't really matter what you choose, but I can tell you here epsilon was 0.25 and delta was 0.5. That's what I chose. And I run the usual threshold linear dynamics, and this is what happens. So the activity always, in this case, no matter what the initial conditions are, falls into a limit cycle where the neurons fire in order of the cycle. So they follow the arrows of the graph. Even though everyone's inhibiting everybody, because this inhibition is weaker than say, neuron 1's own self-leak term, it's going to move. The activity is going to move via a kind of disinhibition mechanism. Okay? All right. So these networks can be complicated. All right? So I've just told you it's sort of very simple. You only have two types of values for the interactions. But here I've put together a network with 9 neurons, and just to show you that the same network can have this rich variety of attractors. So here I have 2 fixed points, honest-to-goodness stable fixed points, like you would see in something like the Hopfield model or the symmetric case of threshold linear networks. There's also a limit cycle, and there's also a chaotic attractor. This is deterministic chaos here. And this all, what chooses which one is initial conditions, as usual. A different initial condition will take you into a different one of these attractors. But there can be this nice richness to the landscape of attractors. And here, because I know how to make networks, if I make an oriented graph with no sinks, a large random one, so this one has 50 nodes, but I can make bigger ones, of course, I can simulate activity and be guaranteed that I'm never going to go to a stable fixed point, right? Even with different connectivity statistics, right? So I don't need to play with the parameters, and I don't need with the strength of the connectivity or the statistics of connectivity. Just by guaranteeing that the graph is oriented with no sinks, I can guarantee that my activity will keep moving. And I like this example just because you seem to have this kind of spontaneous phase transition, right? So I used to look at auditory cortex data in the synchronized and desynchronized state and all this stuff, and we would see these sort of desynchronized activity becoming synchronized. And so what's happening here, I think, is that the activity is falling into a periodic attractor, right? And that's why you're getting the rhythmic activity. Okay, so some important facts about these combinatorial threshold linear networks. They display a rich variety of nonlinear dynamics, and this is what I want to really emphasize. They're actually mathematically tractable, not completely yet, but to a larger degree than I ever expected. And because all the nodes are identical, and there are very few parameters. For fixed parameters, the only thing that's changing in the network is that underlying graph. So you're really isolating, sort of controlling for all the other things, and you're really isolating the role of connectivity. What can connectivity alone, in the absence of any other heterogeneity or variation, do for your dynamics, right? What kind of rich variety of dynamics can connectivity alone give you? And one of the things that I hope I'll convince you of today is that many aspects of the dynamics are actually independent of these parameter choices within those legal parameter regimes that I showed you before. So I'm going to show you basically proofs. I'm not going to show you proofs, don't worry. I'm going to show you results that have been proven that basically show only the graph is controlling the aspect of the dynamics. And another thing that's quite interesting that you can see in this model is that non-local properties of the dynamics are really important. So I want to come back to this simple 3-cycle, right? It's just like a very baby example. The model, of course, is just a family of models, so you can have an arbitrary graph, arbitrary size. So if I add another node, this node 4, that is a source term, right? So this is a source in the graph. It only has edges coming out of it. Interestingly, or maybe not surprisingly, if you already get used to the intuition that activity follows the edges of the graph, that source guy dies, no matter what the initial condition, and you hit the same attractor on the nose, right? So these are two different networks. One has 4 neurons, one has 3 neurons, but the attractor you get is identical, okay? And this source guy always dies. So this is an observation we made early on, and the question is this a general principle? If I take any graph or any subgraph and it has actually a source in it, am I guaranteed that that source guy is going to die and that my attractor will be invariant under adding or removing that source? And now I'm going to indulge you in a little math puzzle because what seems to matter a lot, one of the things we've learned in this model, what seems to matter a lot is not just what the sort of underlying motif is that is supporting the attractor, like in this case a 3-cycle, but also how it's embedded in the larger network. So here is a puzzle where I have a network here that has some 3-cycles in it, right? So you can see here 1, 4, 5 is a 3-cycle. And if I were to restrict just to 1, 4, and 5, I would see a limit cycle corresponding to that 3-cycle. Similarly, 2, 3, 5 is a 3-cycle, and I see a limit cycle corresponding to that 3-cycle. But I do not see the limit cycle for 1, 4, 5. Okay? That one does not appear in this network. No matter what initial conditions you choose, obviously I haven't sampled all initial conditions, so you have to trust me that I did a thorough enough sampling. But this one, there's just no attractor for it. And you might look at this network, and it looks very symmetric, right? I mean, here 1 goes to 2, here 3 goes to 4. What's the difference between these two 3-cycles? Right? Why does one of them give rise to a limit cycle and the other doesn't? It has something to do with the way that 3-cycle is embedded in the larger network. This one is no good. This one survives, and its attractor survives to the larger network. Similarly, down here I have 3 3-cycles in my graph, but only 2 of them. And interestingly, it's the 2 that are next to each other here. These 2 produce limit cycles. This one does not. That's like a puzzle. I'll give you a prize if you solve it. No, I actually have the solution. I'll tell you the solution. Too bad. But, I mean, think about it. I show you this because, so I know the solution now, and I will share it with you. But for about 6 months, we could not make heads or tails as to what was different about these different 3-cycles. Why did some of them yield attractors and others didn't? Here's another. So these first 2 are the graphs I just showed you. A and B are the 2 that I just showed you. What's interesting about this family, where you can really see the complexity that emerges, is that all 4 of these graphs have identical degree sequence. Meaning, if I were to list the in-out degree pairs of all the nodes, here they are, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2. 2, 2 is the node 5 in the middle, right? Has 2 in and 2 out. That degree sequence is identical. So in terms of connectivity statistics, there is 0 difference between these graphs. And of course, the model has identical neurons. Locally, everything is the same. So these 4 networks are locally identical, okay? But the dynamics are totally different. So this one we already saw has 1 limit cycle. This one has 2 limit cycles. That's the full set of attractors. This one has chaos, 4 chaotic attractors. It's very symmetric, right? So once you have one, you have them all. This one really does have true symmetry among all 4 limit cycles. But you can see here, this is a kind of a funny projection where you can see all 4 chaotic attractors. And you see there's an unstable fixed point here in the middle of each one. You see that eye? And so what's happening is the activity is sort of rotating around this unstable fixed point, but occasionally it gets sucked in, right, through a stable direction, and then wheels back out. And you can see that in this pinching behavior here. And the timing of that pinch is basically random, right? It depends very sensitively on initial conditions, and so it has the hallmarks of deterministic chaos. And then this last one, same connectivity statistics, is really boring, just 3 stable fixed points. Okay? So locally, these networks are all the same. In terms of their dynamics, completely different. What's different? The global structure of the graph, right? And so the reason I point this out is not to depress you, that is hopeless to understand, but to sort of show you a simple model like this really can capture some of what's really difficult about trying to predict dynamics from connectivity. Okay, here's another math puzzle. So this is a graph with 7 neurons. It's actually a tournament. So you do have an edge between every 2 nodes, but it's oriented. And here I've just redrawn the same graph, but highlighting a particular cycle, this 1, 7, 6, 3, 4, 5, 1, because that sequence emerges, right? It just naturally emerges. There's no feed-forward structure that we can see in this graph. There are many cycles, in fact, but of all the cycles in this graph, every initial condition produces this attractor. Okay, so this is another nice thing about this model is it gives you kind of a toy model in which you can start exploring how connectivity, more complicated connectivity, can give rise to sequences. And just so you know, what I have in the back of my head that I would like to really study with ideas that I get from this model are things like emergent sequences in hippocampus, like ripple sequences, where some of them seem to replay sequences that occur during behavior, but the vast majority of them seem to just kind of emerge and reflect some structure of the network. And because these areas in hippocampus like CA3 are recurrently connected, somehow you must imagine that sequences can arise even if you don't have a chain-like architecture, like in this case, just from the recurrence. So how does that happen? Okay, so now let me tell you the basic strategy. Even though I don't care so much about stable fixed points, it turns out that if I look at the pattern of stable and unstable fixed points, it gives me a lot of insight into the dynamics. So, and this is not so surprising. So I already pointed out in our set of chaotic attractors here that you have these unstable fixed points that are kind of lying there. Those of you who know about hop bifurcations, right, realize that often you get limit cycles because you have some stable fixed point that becomes unstable via bifurcation. And in the Lorenz attractor, right, that's the famous chaotic attractor you've probably all seen, you also have these unstable fixed points in the middle here, right, that are kind of controlling the dynamics. So, so our strategy is going to really be to look at unstable fixed points as a way of predicting which attractors survive to the larger network and how the dynamics are shaped. Here's another example. So this graph is very symmetric. It's actually every node points forward to the next 3. Right? And so it's completely cyclically symmetric, and you expect exactly something like this. So if you run the model on this graph, you get a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, exactly what you would expect. But interestingly, there are some initial conditions that give you a quasi-periodic attractor that's crazy. So here, I mean, the sequence is it's basically skipping. So it goes 1 to 4 to 7, right? You have that cycle in the graph as well. But the activity looks really sloppy, and you really have this beautiful torus traced out. And so this is actually an honest-to-goodness quasi-periodic attractor. And in such a simple network, we see this. And that one is not really predicted by the idea of the unstable fixed point. So it's not going to be perfect. But if we go back to this puzzle, I'm not going to completely solve it now, but I'm going to give you a clue. If I look at these 3 cycles and ask again the question, which ones give rise to limit cycles, it turns out if I look at fixed points supported on these, only the fixed point for the limit cycle survives. So actually, there is a fixed point corresponding to that 1, 4, 5, but it lies outside the chamber. Right? Somehow, when I've embedded my 3 cycle in the larger network, that fixed point moved outside the appropriate chamber, and it's no longer a fixed point of the larger network. So the fixed point survival is giving us a clue, and the same exact story here, as to which motifs have attractors that survive to the larger network. Of course, now I'm just moving the question, right? So now the question is, well, which 3 cycles have surviving fixed points? Right? I still want to understand this from the graph. I don't want to have to compute the fixed points. I want to sort of look at the structure of the graph and be able to predict that answer. Okay, so this takes me into our graphical analysis of fixed points. So the goal, as I said before, is to analyze the graph and predict the stable and unstable fixed points. And I'm going to call this set, as a function of the graph, FP for fixed points of G. And it's just the set of supports. Remember, I told you there can be at most 1 fixed point per support. Once you know the support, actually, it's trivial to work out what the fixed point is. So the entire game of figuring out the stable and unstable fixed points is the game of figuring out which subsets of neurons support a fixed point. And so that's what we're going to try to compute. So So, what are fixed points? Well, we need all the derivatives to be 0 at some point. And you can have this happen in a variety of ways. And so this is just some notation. These y's are going to, yi equals 0 is going to define the hyperplane where I cross that threshold for the nonlinearity. And so, I have actually a system of inequalities that I need to satisfy in order to have a fixed point. So there is some straightforward. I mean, if I give you one network and I give you all the parameters and everything, you can work it out by hand. It's tedious, but there is a way to access all the fixed points just by doing a lot of calculations. But our goal is to look at the graph, right? To develop a kind of graphical calculus. It's just like in regular calculus. You don't take the limit of every function you want to differentiate, right? You learn rules. Polynomials have nice patterns and so on, right? And so we want to do the same thing with the graphs. So here is an example just to show you how complicated it can be. It's a very simple network, with this graph. And if I look at the hyperplane arrangement, so this is a picture of it, I see that I've labeled all the fixed points here, and the red ones are the ones that are actually lying in their appropriate chambers, and the black ones lie outside the chamber. So they're fixed points of one of the linear systems, but they're not sitting in the appropriate chamber, and so they're not fixed points of the whole network. And so I can work out that my fixed point supports are 3, so I have a fixed point supported on that sink. I have a fixed point supported on this click, 1, 2, and I have a fixed point for the full support, 3 fixed points, okay? And so, again, you can do this in a tedious way for very small networks, but our goal is to have graphical rules that we can apply to arbitrary networks. Okay, so here come the graph rules. All right, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically we have a lot of technical results that apply to TLNs in general, special linear networks in general. And so I sort of group these into 3 ideas. So parity, actually, this is something you see in a lot of dynamical systems. There's a kind of index you can associate to every fixed point, and if you sum the indices, the sum is related to the Euler characteristic of the region containing your state space and so on. And so in our case, processing that, it actually all comes from the Hairy-Ball theorem. Have you guys heard of the can't comb a hairy ball? You know that? So it's the same, it's the same theorem underlying this. But one of the things we get out of this in our case is that the total, so we have this nice, the indices have to sum to 1. In particular, that means the total number of fixed points has to be odd, which actually helps us because sometimes we can look at all the lower order fixed points and we don't know about the full graph, and then we can just determine based on parity whether the full graph supports a fixed point or not. And then there are also these, this is actually new stuff for our networks, these sign conditions, and also this concept of domination that I'll go into more detail on. But basically, the message here is we have some theorems, some theoretical results that allow us to come up with these graph rules. Okay, so let me give you some examples of the kinds of rules. So the first thing we found is that any subgraph that has uniform in degree supports a fixed point. And so what are uniform in degree? So that means every node in that subnetwork, right, if you restrict to the subnetwork, the in degree is the same. So in particular, a simple cycle is uniform in degree 1. Whether it's a 3 cycle, a 4 cycle, a 5 cycle, an n cycle, those are all uniform in degree 1. But you can also, of course, have uniform in degree 2. And it doesn't have to be cyclically symmetric. So here's an example. We call this one the Tadpole. Right? So it's a 3 cycle and then has this thing hanging out. And it's also uniform in degree 1. All of these guys support stable fixed points. And the question, though, right, is we already saw with the 3 cycle, just because you see a 3 cycle embedded in your network doesn't mean you get an attractor for it, right? So whether the subgraph is a fixed point support depends on how it's embedded in the larger graph. And the remarkable thing, you're asking a question? Oh, that's a typo. Sorry. 4 should go to 5. I'm sorry. Yeah, no one's ever noticed that before. Yes, very good. Very sharp. Okay, that makes me more nervous. All right. So it may or may not survive to the full graph, okay? And the remarkable thing is that we know precisely when it does. So if G has uniform in degree D, the fixed point survives to the full graph if and only if there is no node outside of that subgraph that receives d plus 1 or more edges from it. That's the rule. And notice the rule does not depend on epsilon, delta, or theta, right? That's because that all drops out of the proof. Okay, so it really is determined purely by the structure of the graph whether or not the fixed point survives. As a corollary, if you have a simple cycle of any length, that's going to support a fixed point, and therefore you expect the attractor associated to that cycle to survive to the larger network, if and only if there is no external node receiving 2 or more edges from the cycle. So in particular, this is one of the graphs from math puzzle number 1. And what is wrong with 1, 4, 5? We can now see that. You see the problem? There's that node 2 that's receiving 2 edges from it. That's why the fixed point dies. And that's why there's no limit cycle associated to that 3 cycle. In contrast, 2, 3, 5, 4 only receives 1 edge from it, and 1 only receives 1 edge from it. And so it doesn't have the problem. Okay? And this explains the full puzzle. It also explains the ones down here. Okay? It's precisely when the fixed point survives, which is precisely when there is not an external node that gets too many edges from that subgraph. Okay. So there's another general principle underlying this, coming from one of those technical results, which we call domination. And here, I'm going to give you the simplest version of it. So there are many versions of it that come out of the same theorem. But in terms of checking from the graph, this is probably the simplest. So we say that if you have 2 nodes in a subset of neurons, in a subnetwork, we say that K dominates J with respect to that subnetwork if J goes to K, but K does not go back to J. Okay, so you have to have a unidirectional connection between them. And every input that J gets, K also gets. Right? So you see that K is kind of getting more input, although everything is inhibitory, right? But it's getting more of the weak inhibition than J is. And somehow that makes the fixed point untenable. Like, fixed points have to have a kind of balance, or they have to be sort of equitable in their distribution of edges in and out. And so you can see here in this this is just a regular path, but 2 dominates 1 because 1 goes to 2, 2 does not go back to 1, and 1 doesn't get any inputs, right? And so 2 trivially gets all the inputs that 1 gets. And that means that this, and any path, in fact, any path of any length, cannot support a fixed point, which should not surprise us because that feels like a feed-forward structure, right? You don't expect to have attractors being supported on that, but nevertheless, it's nice that we can actually prove that in general. In this graph, we have 1 dominates 2 and 3. So this is more complicated, right? You might not know a priori whether or not this subnetwork can support a fixed point. There's a lot of recurrence, right? It could be that there's an unstable fixed point and maybe some dynamic attractor supported on this as a motif. But actually, because of domination, I can tell you, nope, that is not going to support a fixed point, and therefore it's not going to support, it's probably not going to support an attractor. Okay, so this follows from the theorem that if there is domination inside sigma, then sigma cannot be a fixed point support. And some consequences I've already told you. This thing about sources, right? If I have a proper source in a subnetwork, something that only has edges out and none in, there can never be a fixed point supported on such a subgraph. So you'd have to take the source away and look at what's remaining. So feed-forward graphs, similarly, will always have some kind of domination in them because of the feed-forward structure. So again, this shouldn't surprise us if we intuitively take the graph seriously, but it's not clear that we can take the graph seriously, right? But the nice thing about this model is that your intuition about the graph really does give you intuition about the dynamics. And then if you know what a directed click is, that's a kind of a generalization of a click. Those also, despite the recurrence, cannot support fixed points. And so they actually behave a lot like feed-forward structures, which is something that I think is kind of a new and surprising idea, at least in this model, right? So who knows what happens in other networks. But at least it gives us some things to look for. So we have a lot of graph rules at this point, and I'll just summarize them and summarize the main ones in this table. But the basic take-home message here is that we really can analyze the graph and tell you a lot of things about who the attractors are going to be. Okay, so, and this is just, I'll quickly go through this just to show you how it works. using the graph rules, I can actually go through supports of size 1, of size 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I can tell you this is just coming from graph rules. I can work out completely who the unstable fixed points are of this network. And because it was obtained from graph rules, this result is guaranteed to be independent of parameters, right? So I don't have to check. I don't have to run through different epsilons and deltas and convince myself that the parameters don't matter. I know because I'm using tools that are parameter independent. OK, so what are some lessons we've learned from the graph rules? So first, we found specific motifs, right, that support fixed points, and maybe they're familiar, but one of the new things is that we actually understand their survival rules, right, how the motif is embedded in a larger network, and I think that that idea is probably more general than just our toy model, right? The way that a motif is embedded in a larger network is going to have a lot to do with whether or not you're actually going to get an attractor associated to it. And then we have this kind of balance inside a motif that supports an attractor, right, that it has to be somehow equitable or domination-free. And we also know certain things about how edges affect motifs. So edges coming out of a motif affect the survival of it in the larger network. Edges coming in do not. So if I add edges coming in and my motif is embedded in a larger network, kind of like a sink, and only edges come in, it doesn't actually affect survival, but it affects the basins of attraction. So your attractor will stay the same on the nose in the larger network, but the basin of attraction will be affected by how many and which edges are coming in. And then, of course, adding edges inside of a motif may or may not preserve the attractor structure. And we have interesting examples here where some edges seem to matter and some don't. And in this toy model, we can actually study that. All right, and I've already talked about the parameter independence. So I have like 1 minute. So let me show you some applications really quickly. So first, I want to go back to this hippocampal place cell thing. And one of the things that I wanted to do was make a network that had this little, from this toy model, okay? Obviously, many people have made networks with phase precession, and I don't pretend to compete with all those models. But just to give you an example, here I have a motif that's just a cyclic 5 module, right? So this is cyclically symmetric, and I'm just gluing them together. So it's kind of like a continuum attractor, right? I'm gluing together attractors along a line, but instead of being fixed points, they're all little limit cycles. And I know that these limit cycles will survive because this is uniform in degree 2, and there are no nodes outside that receive 3 edges. You see, node 6 receives 2 edges from this guy. And so I actually know from my theory that that limit cycle should survive in the larger network. And indeed it does. So if I look at this network and I pick the right initial conditions, I will run in this limit cycle. But then if I imagine, the rad is moving forward, different inputs are coming in, and I'm kicking the system. So these blocks here represent kicking various neurons to move the activity forward. So here I'm kicking neuron 3 to get it initiated, then neuron 6, 9, 12, and so on. What happens is then you slide over to the next limit cycle. So you have the sequence of limit cycles, and the kicks coming from, say, sensory inputs or some other drive are moving you forward, and so you get this kind of activity that's reminiscent in a cartoon way, but nevertheless reminiscent of what you're seeing here. Interestingly, right, despite the symmetry and the regularity of this network, right, you see this is very, very regular, you get a very sloppy total population activity, right? So it's like this is kind of like your LFP. It's very crazy, and the activity looks very irregular, but the network itself is very patterned. So that to me is interesting because a lot of times we see all this sloppy, noisy-looking activity, and we think, oh, that means the architecture is also very irregular. But it doesn't have to be. It could actually be more regular than we think. Maybe I'll skip over. You can also make, central pattern generator circuits, cartoon ones, right? Where here I have 2 different gates for like a horse, bound and trot gate. I don't know much about this. This is like something I did for fun, something we did for fun. But the reason I show this is because it was very easy to just build the network. We had such good intuition about how the graph is controlling the attractors that we could just put this together literally in 15 minutes on an airplane, then run the MATLAB code, and voila, it really did produce the 2 different limit cycles we wanted in one shot, right? So the intuition about the graph structure really is very good in these networks. And then here's sort of an example of like this phone number network. So this is interesting because once you see that you have one limit cycle, you know you have them all by symmetry, right? So here I have 5 layers, m neurons per layer, and once I see one limit cycle of activity running through, I know that I have m to the 5th limit cycles by symmetry. And so you could really encode any of these. And so what's the difference? Well, something about the initial conditions is biasing towards a particular neuron in every layer. And by the time the activity wraps back around, say that red neuron still has a little more activity in it than the other ones. And so it wins, right? There's like winner take all on every layer here. And so it keeps winning. But if you put too many layers, if you make this too long, then it breaks down, right? Then by the time the activity wraps back around, it's forgotten who was the one firing in this layer, and then you just get synchrony on each layer, right? So there's sort of a capacity how many things you can store in a network like this. Okay, I am really out of time. So I'm going to have to skip this part. So we also have an algorithm, actually, for predicting sequences from graph structure, which I'm not going to be able to tell you about. So anyway, too bad. We'll skip that. And finally, there's some references. Unfortunately, we are in the process of writing all of this up. But we did put some preprints online if you're curious, and also slides from this talk. And feel free to contact us if you're curious. Do try this at home. These are really easy networks to code and play with. And so all the information for actually playing with them yourself is in this work. And then I just want to finish by thanking, again, my collaborators and funding. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions while the next speaker comes to set up.
So the proofs are based on threshold linear.
Yes.
How much survives, even numerically, if you go to sigmoid?
So numerically, I think a lot survives. In terms of the proofs, it would take some work to show that the proofs survive. So right now, the proofs very heavily depend on that form. So that's how it is.
So I'll have a follow-up on that, so what if it was threshold linear saturating? So you still have the linearity.
Yeah.
So it's not a straight up nonlinear. Would that work?
So we have thought about that, but we haven't worked on it.
Okay.
But I think that's actually the first place we would go. Exactly. That's the first place to go because there the proof techniques can survive. Absolutely.
So I'm very much in favor of studying simplified models as a way for gaining insight, and this was beautiful. I have another question, maybe again, another follow-up. Your networks are very uniform in the sense that there are just 2 synaptic weights, and also all the time constants are the same.
Yep.
Do you have a sense for whether some of the results that you have are robust to even tiny perturbations to that?
So numerically, yes, but in terms of the proofs, it depends on that at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So really, I mean, the way I think about it is, threshold linear networks are huge. There's this huge parameter space. And so you can pick a point and perturb around it, right, and do sort of random matrix theory type things. What the CTLNs allow you to do is basically pick points that are far away in this parameter space. But then you still kind of have to explore what's happening when you perturb around them. And we absolutely plan to do that, but just not yet.
Okay, we'll have to save the other questions for the break. Let's thank Carina again.